computer. Hi, I'm Linda Lambert, and today I'm talking with Linda Morrow. Hi, Linda.
Hello, Linda.
She contributed a piece to Spring and All, the anthology that's written and edited by Red Wheelbarrow Writers and published by Lisa Daly's Sidekick Press in Bellingham, Washington. The anthology was juried, which was new to Red Wheelbarrow Writers, and it includes poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. I really like Linda Morrow's piece. It's just different from all the rest. And you'll recognize this by the title, which is Searching for My Spiritual Roots. It starts with a description of her first experience in Sunday school. So she's going to read a bit of that from Spring and All. And if you happen to have the book, it's on page 138.
Okay. On an October Sunday in 1945, sunshine streamed through 3 large windows and left patterns on the tiled floor of the children's classroom of the First Parish Unitarian Church in Needham, Mass., a Boston suburb. Holding my hand, my mother bent down and said reassuringly, "See Jane over there? It looks like she's saving the seat next to her for you. You'll be just fine, and I will be here to pick you up when class is over." I nodded, let go of Mommy's hand, and walked over to where children, seated in a circle on small wooden chairs, chatted quietly. I wasn't nervous. I went to kindergarten 5 mornings a week and loved it. So Sunday school should be easy, right? No fuss, no bother.
Absolutely not. I had a similar experience when I went to Sunday school at about the same age in California. But it wasn't all smooth after that. Later, the teacher explains what's going to happen during the day, Bible stories and singing and so forth. And then there's going to be an offering. But guess what? Linda doesn't know what an offering is. She doesn't know what it means. So then what happened, Linda?
Well, it was time for the offering. Mrs. Patterson took out a shiny silver plate, put some money on it, and passed it to the kid sitting next to her. Around the circle went the plate. By the time it got to me, it was filled with coins. Oh, I thought, what a nice way to welcome me to Sunday school. I reached in with one hand and grabbed a fistful of money. So that's how I started off with my experience of church.
I don't know that anybody else has done that before. I wouldn't have considered reaching in, but you had your mind on money, and it seemed totally sensible to practical little Linda at tender age 5 or 6 or whatever you were. And you continued right through going to Sunday school up until about age 10. Your parents were active in a Unitarian church. You went to your youth group. I think this was with the same place. You visited Catholic Cathedral. You visited an AME church. You visited the Quakers. You got some exposure, and you had developed a sense that people worship differently.
Yeah.
But after you got to be 10, there was really no regular church attendance. So why was that?
Well, we moved from the town that we were living in, Needham, to a town further south from Boston, and there was no Unitarian church in that town. We started going to a church that I think my parents felt denominationally would be similar. It was called a community church. I just didn't have the same interest anymore in the church. And I mean, I sort of periodically went, but the major attraction for me was the fact that the youth group had rented the high school gymnasium on Sunday evenings to play pickup basketball. So I loved basketball. It was my favorite sport in high school. And so I continued to go mostly so that I could play basketball on Sunday evenings. And any reading of the Bible got sort of left behind in the dust.
Mhm. Well, I know because you've written about baseball and
Yeah.
Little League and so forth that I'm not going to say you were a jock, but you were like me, a bit
I
of
was.
a tomboy who really liked sports, and that's
I was, and I was really fortunate that I went to a high school that actually in the 1950s had girls interscholastic sports. I just took that for granted, but looking back now, I realize how special that was.
yeah, that really was special. So nothing at that point kick-started your interest in, well, I don't want to presume that you weren't spiritual or didn't have some spiritual yearnings, but in any case, you weren't affiliated with the church and you weren't thinking much about your own spiritual progression in life. So why did that then change that you came to the point of being interested again?
Um, I think there's always been a piece of me that was very spiritual. For a long time, I called it my intuition, and
Mm-hmm.
I just think I've always paid attention to that intuition. And um, I mean, I had events in my life which certainly could have led me back to church. I had a younger sister who died when I was 23. She was 21. She died of lupus, and then my firstborn son Steve was born with Down syndrome. And I think either one of those events could have led me back to the church or some church,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't. And the two things happened. One was the election of 2016, and the other was getting a cancer diagnosis. And those sound pretty unrelated, but in my mind, they hang together. So um, in about 2018, I think, uh, I was part of a writers group, and we would meet, I think, monthly and share work, and usually around a dinner. And so we were meeting at one of the writers' homes, and I said to my friend Nancy, what would Jesus do if he met Trump? Nancy was very involved in church, has always been, um, comes from a faith-based childhood, and has always been involved in the church. So, what would Jesus do if he met Trump?
Mm-hmm.
Looked at me and said, probably ask him to dinner. I had no idea what she meant by that. And then she said, would you be interested in doing a Bible study with me? And I thought, why not? And so we started, and we are still going strong today. And so it's been well over 5 years. We took a break during the pandemic, but that's led me to read the Bible, which I really had never done before. And
And hadn't you identified as a lesbian agnostic, and she was an evangelistic, more or less Christian, which is a pretty interesting confluence of two seemingly different approaches.
right, we couldn't be more different, really, on that particular spectrum. And what that Bible study did was, or has done for me, is really taken me back to that experience I had um, as a, say, 5 to 10 year old in the Unitarian Church. And I really never felt like that had much of an impact on me. Um, But then as I started reading the Bible and listening to some of the beliefs that Nancy has that have been part of her roots forever, we share a lot of similarities and we share some pretty significant differences.
Mm-hmm. Well, how do you work out those different so-called differences?
Say it again.
How do you handle those
Well,
so-called
we
differences?
basically just sort of acknowledge that we come from very different upbringings.
Uh-huh.
And, I think all of us are shaped tremendously by what we experience as children and growing up in our various homes. So we just acknowledge that this is something that we're probably never going to agree on, but it doesn't get in the way from the main point, which my takeaway has been that however one considers Jesus, whether they consider Jesus to be a human form of God, or a great spiritual teacher, or something in between that, he seems to have spent his life championing the underdog.
Yes.
And that really resonated for me because that's always been a part of who I am. And go back to the sports, it even translates into sports so that I am always rooting for the underdog in a sports event.
Except it has to do with the Reds Sox.
Oh, but they're pretty much the underdogs right now. No, but seriously,
Get it?
it's really made me think back to those experiences that I did have as a young child in the Unitarian Church.
Mhm.
And they clearly had a much stronger impact on me than I realized at the time. And I find that pretty interesting that in reading the Bible, really can relate to a lot of the stories in there about how Jesus treated people as he grew in his ministry. And I think that's the way I've always wanted to treat people, that I've always aimed for, not always successfully, obviously, but and I think it's what's missing in our society today. So that was one piece. And then the other piece is getting this very unexpected cancer diagnosis in 2021. And that really makes you think about your mortality. And so it's really fundamentally changed me.
Well, it's interesting to me that all those things that you learned in those first 10 years of life, five to 10 years that you were having experiences in Sunday school and youth groups and so on, were embedded in you. And so when you had exposure to the scriptures and to studying the Bible, particularly the New Testament, you recognize them as part of your own personal learning. And I think even coming from studying with someone from a different faith or different perspective, you can rivet on those things that Jesus did and find commonality. And it seems like that's what you have done.
Yes, and it also it's really brought me a sense of peace. I mean, I think the biggest thing my biggest takeaway from getting a cancer diagnosis was, oh, guess what, Linda? You're really not in control like you thought you might be.
Yeah.
Um, so having something to fall back on, and again, I don't know if it's God. I have no idea. But I feel that my spirituality has increased. I take time many times a day to just sort of sit back and reflect on what's happening, and I have I call it my prayer routine when I get into bed at night. And it's dark and I close my eyes and I go through this routine that probably takes, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes, but it's a series of I, s- sing to myself a couple of hymns. Uh,
Wonderful.
I have a list of people that I go through each day.
Yeah.
We're on that, and then I say the 21st Psalm, and then I have sort of a mantra at the end, and that calms me, that settles me. Um, it gives me peace, and I do it every night.
It's almost the equivalent of what a chant is supposed to do, I think. The routine, the knowledge, the drawing upon a higher power. Uh, it's kind of soul settling, it sounds like.
Well, and I think I've realized also that you don't need a building and you don't need to be part of a formal organized religion in order to feel grounded and to have a sense of peace. And I know that, I mean, one of the things for me was I have three adult sons, two of whom are living. And when my
Mhm.
oldest son, Steve, was born with Down syndrome and then died when he was 49, at his death, I really felt a hole in my life. Like I knew other people um, had a place to go with to put their grief into some sort of a religious context. I
Mhm.
had tried to say to me, Steve is at peace now. Steve is whole now, and I
Yeah.
didn't really know what that meant. And in fact, in some cases, it almost offended me. But uh, I knew I was wishing for some place to put some of that grief, and I think I found that place now. Yeah, it feels good.
Are really significantly changed after these three experiences, but the political situation was a catalyst,
Mhm.
but uh, Bible study with Nancy, and then also the death of Steve. Um, some significant changes in how you approach life, how you feel.
And it's interesting because I neither of my living sons have any religious underpinnings that I'm aware of. They certainly didn't get any growing up.
Mhm.
Um, I live. My wife has absolutely no religious thoughts whatsoever, and she's been really supportive to the extent that we talk about it. But I don't talk about it that much because with family members because I don't feel like they would understand it. And that's okay. Because I think that's actually a good thing. I don't feel like I have to defend where I'm at. I know where I'm at, and I'm happy with that.
And also, I think that's one of the great benefits of having what you wrote in this book. It's it's an opportunity for someone who might be similarly seeking, or even eventually for your children who and your family members who may read it,
Yeah,
will understand you better as a person.
it's interesting. I can't remember whether I've sent this out to my. I don't think I have sent it out to my sons. I sent it out to my daughter-in-law that lives in Bellingham. She said, "Oh, I understand you have a piece in spring and all." And I got somewhat of a response back from her, but
Yeah.
That's fine.
I know we write what we write, and we hope that it finds readers. And the most important thing, at least for me, is that we wrote it and it is there and it
Yeah.
is accessible. And
I
and
think what writing has taught me is that you write first for yourself. I mean, you hope that you're also writing for an audience, but
Yeah.
um, you do write first for yourself, and so it's never been that critical for me that my children or my wife understand, or in some cases even read what I've written. Sue always reads what I've written. I'm not sure my sons do, but Sue does.
yeah, I gave copies of a book in which I had a poem to all my kids. So that was quite a few copies. And I haven't really heard that much, except that my daughter had it laying out on the kitchen table, open to my poem, so that the kids would read it, which, that kind of pleased me. It was so her. But tell me a little bit about, well, I saw a line in your story. Healing from trauma isn't linear, but Steve's death and my cancer have enriched my life in unexpected ways. I think that's so profound, and I want to know a little bit more about this book that you wrote and that Sidekick Press published a couple of years ago, and how that came to be. Read a little bit if you'd like to.
Okay, well, I mean, before I read from it, Steve was born in 1966, and I didn't know at the time of his birth, nor was I told that he had Down syndrome, even though the um, doctor, the obstetrician who delivered him knew that, but nothing was said to me. And then when Steve was about 2 weeks old, my husband at the time, Roger, got a phone call from the pediatrician who we'd only met obviously once in the hospital. And he said that, well, he said to Roger, I never got to meet you at the hospital. I'd like you to come down to my office so we can talk. And so Raj did. And Raj was told at that time that Steve had Down syndrome. But he was also told not to tell me, that I wouldn't be strong enough so soon after having given birth to
He didn't know you.
news like that. And so I didn't find out until Steve was almost 2 months old and had his first well baby checkup. And the pediatrician told me at that point. I think readers today would wonder, how could you not have known that your baby had Down syndrome? I mean, he had all the physical characteristics of a baby with Down syndrome. Well, what readers need to understand is that in 1966, you didn't see people with Down syndrome. They were all institutionalized. And so I'd never seen anyone with Down syndrome. And it was only in writing this book, and I remember so distinctly the day that I had this epiphany, and I'm writing, and I realized that, because I'd really always held a grudge against the pediatrician and against my husband for not telling me. I mean, I just was really angry about that. At some point in writing this, I thought, wow, for 2 months, I had the gift of thinking I had a perfectly typical baby boy. And that was a gift. And I'd never realized it until I was in the process of writing this. So I have to give, I think, credit to the writing process. Um, and the surprise is that, I mean, you would think in writing memoir that, you know, it's not fiction, so you sort of know where you're going. Uh,
Hmm.
and yet I had this revelation that, you know, it took me almost 65 years to realize that, there was something good that came out of my not knowing that my son had Down syndrome.
Hmm. Yeah.
I always knew I would someday write about him. I don't ever remember feeling especially sad. I don't remember thinking, why me?
Hmm.
Raj and I never doubted for a moment that we would raise Steve ourselves, that he would not be institutionalized. Um, I think having two other sons, his middle brother Mike was born 14 months later. And that was intentional on my part. I thought, "God, he's not going to be my only child, and I want to have another baby as soon as I can." Um, so I just raised three little boys, and with all the trauma and hecticness that comes with having three kids, our boys and full of energy and whatever. But um, I really was determined that Steve would have every opportunity to, live as full a life as his brothers lived. And both of his brothers, Mike and Josh, were guides not only for Steve but also for me in helping me figure out how to make that possible. So for the first 18, 20 years of Steve's life, um, he lived at home. He, um, went to school. It took a while to get him into a public school, but, eventually that happened. And, he entered into a job training program, which was just highly unusual. I mean, it was almost accidental that that happened. And he had a job, working in the local grocery store. Everybody in town knew Steve. You know, life was going along pretty smoothly. But then this funny thing happens. Not only does Steve grow up, but his brothers grow up, and they graduate from high school and they leave.
Yeah.
And without almost thinking about it, I have this other realization. I don't want Steve to live with me the rest of my life. I have a life that I want to lead.
Hmm.
Uh, I had come out as a lesbian at age 45. I was now approaching 50. Um, I was working in public education. I wanted a chance to get into administration, and I couldn't do those things if I had Steve living with me at home. So
Sure.
I began to investigate what the options were, and there were very few.
Hmm. You're
So,
still right.
Ed,
Yeah.
so anyway, my husband was my ex-husband at that point was living and working in Albany, New York. We were living in Hanover, New Hampshire, and, Albany being a city did have some options, and I asked Roger to look into them, and he visited several places, and he found a group home in Albany, that he thought might work for Steve. So the second part of Heart of This Family begins when, I load Steve in the car and we leave Hanover and drive the 3.5 hours to Albany, New York, where he's going to be living. And I'll just read it, a section. We've arrived. It's the first time I have seen the group home. I see the room. I'm taken in to see the room where he's going to be living. It looks pretty much like a college dorm room. He has a roommate. I'm taken through the kitchen. I realize that I don't think Steve realizes it, but I realize, he's just not going to have access to food whenever he wants it. It's going to be whenever it's provided. And then we meet with the director of the home to sort of finish the handoff, and that's the section that I'm going to read from. So in the director's office, I produced a 3-inch binder containing the required information. Robert Valancourt, who was Steve's case manager for many years, had compiled a client review. For 3 years, he had guided Steve through his transition from school into the adult world. The review included a copy of Steve's most recent individual service plan, the ISP. Robert also added an 18-page skills inventory, a recent assessment of Steve's competency in every conceivable situation. A comprehensive medical report written by Dr. Boyle contained records back to 1977 when our family had moved to Hanover and he'd first begun treating Steve. Last night, I'd composed a 3-page typewritten letter of my own detailing Steve's various idiosyncrasies, things only a mother could know, and clipped it into the front of the binder. I handed the heavy notebook out to the director with a somber carefulness, as if I were handing her an overfull cup of coffee. Don't spill this, lady. I've filled it to the brim. Nothing can go to waste. Casually, she set it down on her desk. I flinched. I will review this within the week, the director assured us. This information will form the basis of the care plan we developed for, she paused and looked down at her intake sheet, for your son, Steve. I have some additional information for you, I replied. These are 2 letters of recommendation from the Hanover Food Co-op, where Steve has worked weekdays for the past year and a half. After completing their training program, he became the first person with developmental disabilities hired directly by the co-op. Oh, I see. That's interesting. But the day program our clients attend includes a sheltered workshop. What? Steve is now a client and a sheltered workshop instead of a community-based job? I cringed and looked at Roger. You didn't tell me that. My eyes narrowed. I didn't know, he responded. I pulled my arm back. My hand still clutched the glowing reports from Steve's supervisors at the co-op. In this moment, I wanted to run from the director's office, get Steve, and drive him back home. The director continued, Mrs. Cohen, you haven't provided me with your son's medications. I replied that Steve had been taking daily meds on his own for several years, but the director shook her head. Self-medication wasn't allowed at the Albany City Group Home. I pressed my lips together. This woman didn't know my son. She had a stock answer for everything. Anger and fear filled me as I looked at her stout authority. Like a thief, she seemed determined to steal every last vestige of Steve's hard-won independence.
That's just a terrible experience.
Well, it really, I think, pinpointed for me the disconnect that I felt at that time as a mother, but I think it's a disconnect that any parent, and particularly mothers, can recognize. It doesn't matter whether your child is identified as having special needs or not. We spend so much of our life so involved in raising our children and imparting with them values that we think are important for them to have. And then they go out into the world and you don't know what they're going to experience. You don't know how they're going to change. And it's that loss of control you don't anticipate, but there it is. And it was especially difficult for me because as much as I wanted my own life, I also felt I was betraying my son.
Are you going to say a little more about what happened next, or are we simply going to encourage people to go to Village Books or their independent bookstore or to your lmorrow.com website and buy this so they can find out?
Well, what I will say is that my intuition was right. That turned out to be a terrible experience for Steve.
How long did he stay there?
A year and a half. And during that time, he was hospitalized several times. He, I think, fell into a very deep depression.
Mhm.
And basically, what changed was that I stayed in touch with his case manager in Hanover, was able to find an option for him, which was what I had been looking for all along, which was for him to be able to live quasi independently with a professional roommate.
Yeah.
And I was also with somebody, not married at that point because we weren't allowed to get married, but I was with Sue, who was at that point and always has been one of Steve's strongest supporters and strongest allies. And so we were able to find a place for him, for Steve to move back to Hanover, start working again in a grocery store, not the same one that he had. And life goes on from there.
I am I am so happy that you were able to record your experiences as a mom for Steve. The title of the book says a lot, and I think anybody who reads this book will come to know what a special kid, young man, grown up he was. I only got to meet him once.
Good. And
And
you were embedded in his heart because you brought his favorite dessert, cheesecake.
I
And
was tipped off by you. I love that. Where's
but
the cake?
Steve was the living evidence of people whose philosophy in life is eat dessert first. And so and you know the title actually came from Sue.
Didn't know
We Steve eventually was able to, I was able to co-purchase with Steve a condo in Burlington, Vermont, and we had an open house, and a lot of people came. And that evening, as Sue and I were back in our Vermont home, reflecting on what had taken place that day, it was Sue that said, "Steve is the heart of this family." And,
I
that's
love.
where it came from.
Well, you finished the book, and I know you still like to write. What's your process? What what writing are you doing now? How has it been having completed a book and then moving into the unknown world of writing and living your life?
Um, completing a book for me was both really satisfying and left me feeling spent and empty.
Yeah.
And I had well, it took me 8 years to write this book. And for the last 3 of those years, probably, I had a very specific routine where I would go to a local coffee shop and write for 3 or 4 hours just about every day, or certainly every weekday. Um, and I always had the book in my head. Um, I would write a lot of it in my head, either walking or falling asleep at night. And then I had nothing. And that felt like a real void.
Mhm.
And it's continued to be a void. I've written, the only writing I've done has been very sporadically for things like anthologies like Spring and All. But for the last 2 years, thinking about my mortality, I really want to write what I think is a series of essays about my childhood. So spanning the years from I was born in 1940 to say 1958. Probably not for anybody other than family, but who knows? And I think about that a lot, but I haven't been motivated to do anything. And then a week and a half ago, something came across on Facebook. A woman named Brooke Warner, who is the CEO of She Writes Press, put out a call for a very loosely connected writers group that basically would be an accountability group.
Uh-huh.
And you join for the, I think, incredibly reasonable sum of $99.
Yeah.
And we're on a schedule. We meet Thursdays and Sundays for 2 hours.
Hmm.
Brooke, we just had our first meeting on yesterday, and Brooke will do a short craft talk for about 5 minutes, and then she shuts off, mutes everybody, and you write. And I had over 130 people have signed up for this.
My word.
And Brooke has produced a spreadsheet so that you have everybody's name, and then you can fill in as much information as you want, which would include where you live, what most people are writing memoir, so what genre you're writing in, your email address, so on and so forth. And I surprised myself. I had no idea what I was going to write about. I had a list of potential topics, but I didn't know what I was going to pick. And I just started writing. I ended up writing about my maternal grandmother. And I'm really enthused. I feel like I'm sort of back in the saddle again. And I, I have no idea that this is going to continue up until February. The last Sunday of every month is, instead of writing, it's a sharing time, and people can share whatever they feel like sharing. Brooke records everything, so if for some reason you can't attend, it's recorded, it's on video, and you can look at it. And I'm looking forward to it. I think I'll make some connections with people, and we'll, perhaps form groups of our own. But that's where I am in terms of my writing process, and it feels good.
I'm excited about that. And I will be excited to read whatever you write. And I think this is a great note on which to end, because I saw a certain smile arise from your face when you talked about peeling back in the groove again.
Yeah, it feels good. And I just, I mean, I have a granddaughter who's a sophomore in high school, and she's an interesting kid, but she is interested in family history.
Good.
And so I think about her. And then my grandson is 7, and he's kind of an old soul. I don't know what his interest in family history is at this point right now, but I think he'll have some at some point. And I just feel like I want to leave this in some shape or form for them.
Yeah. I have a lot of grandchildren, and I don't know. I'm hoping that at least one will be interested in the things that I leave behind. So I really like working on family history and stories too. So
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'll end on this note, but just think about the telephone.
Okay.
Think about the first phone you remember using. And think about what phones are like today. Now,
Uh,
there used to be this Play School toy telephone that Play School made.
I know what those are.
Now, if you gave that to a child today, would they have a clue as to what it is?
They wouldn't have a clue. They wouldn't have a clue, but they'd know what this was, and I'm taking your picture now. They'd know what this is, wouldn't they?
They would, exactly. And I've seen, you know, infants, kids that are not walking yet, they know how to
Yep,
operate. So something as in a sense mundane as that form of communication has changed,
yeah,
and it changes us as people too. So
just as people.
yeah, that there will probably be an essay about the telephone.
Okay, essay on the telephone. You may hear it here first.
Okay. All right, thanks, Linda. I really appreciated you taking the time to talk with me.
It's been fun. Bye.
Take care.